Hello, everybody. Bienvenido a todos. This is the Paseo Podcast. We're back in action from our summer break. Hard to believe that we're going on year 3 at this point, but I can really think of no better way to kick off this season than by getting our whole podcast team on the show to chat about some Puerto Rico news stories that we would have liked to have talked about or that happened over the summer while we were on break. Joining me today from the Paseo Podcast team are Amber Colon. She is a Puerto Rican writer and editor born and raised in Chicago, a graduate of DePaul University's journalism program. Her work has been featured in These Times, the Austin Weekly News, Common Dreams, and the Chicago Sun-Times. She's the publicist here at the Paseo Podcast and also works as a bartender in her spare time. She's the mom to 2 adorable fur babies, a Maltipoo named Raven and a kitten named Gigi. If you want to follow her after this episode or while you're listening to this episode, you can follow her on Twitter and Instagram. Her handle is @MedicinAmbi. Next up is Josue Ortiz. He is a Chicago native. He currently works as a marketing coordinator and does freelance photography and videography. He's also the person you can all thank for editing and posting our interviews on our Paseo Podcast YouTube channel. So definitely go check those out. When not working or picking up a gig, you can find him playing soccer, taking photos for fun, or going on a hike. You can follow him on Insta at Josue Angel, and his YouTube channel is Josue of the Shy. And last but not least, Richie Regena is in the virtual building. Richie is a Mexican-American journalist from the Chicagoland area. He graduated from DePaul University in 2021 and has bylines in WBEZ, that's NPR's Chicago affiliate, and the Chicago Tribune. He is someone I lean on as our production assistant because honestly, if I had to edit all of the audio, I would probably go crazy. I'd have way more gray hairs than I already do. Richie is also pursuing his career in audio journalism and is working on a master's degree at DePaul while managing the university's bilingual magazine Pueblo at 14 East. You can follow Richie across all major social platforms. His handle is @Richie Regena. Everybody that's a part of our team is definitely worth your time to follow. They're all doing really great work, as you can hear by each of these bios. I'm sure people listening know me, but high level view, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon, founder and host of this podcast, really wanted to start this to help spread Puerto Rican stories, archive our stories not only in the diaspora, not only on La Isla, but around the world. Born and raised in Chicago, I also went to DePaul University. I'm a double demon, got my master's and bachelor's there. Super happy to be with you all today. This is the first time we have actually recorded a podcast as a team. So pretty excited about this episode. Like I said at the top, there's a lot of news that happened just before we took our break and happened during break. So just want to talk about some stories that happened while we were away, kind of how they connect to the larger narrative around Puerto Rico. So here's how today is going to work. We have some light topics. We have some heavy topics for the show. We're going to talk about some amazing Puerto Rican athletes that made news this summer, PR's climate crisis, Lin-Manuel Miranda's storytelling, and the dark reality of Puerto Rico's tax code and embrace of cryptocurrency. There are some good stories, but it's very easy to kind of think of the flip side and the negative side of a lot of these stories. So we want to end on some bullet point, quick, rapid fire, positive stories around Puerto Rico to cap off the show. Hope you all enjoy what you listen to. I wanted to have first a discussion around the Tokyo Olympics just wrapped up. Jasmine Camacho-Quinn, amazing athlete. This was only the second Olympic gold medal for Puerto Rico. And she won that Olympic gold medal in the 100-meter hurdle. And she also set a new Olympic record of 12.26 seconds in the semifinal for that competition. So again, this is only the second Olympic gold medal for Puerto Rico, and that's following Monica Puig's win in women's tennis in 2016. And it was Puerto Rico's first gold in track and field and its second medal in the sport. The other medal was a bronze in the men's 400 meter hurdle, and that was won by Javier Colson in 2012. So really big deal, especially for her as an athlete. I discovered that she was actually disqualified in the Rio Olympics in the semifinals. She just didn't make time. So other people were faster than her, but she's the best hurdler in the world this year. Really no equal. And if you got to see that race, beast. I mean, she was just a machine. The way she just really commanded that 100-meter hurdle. So when she breaks this record, she wins this gold medal. It's definitely a historic win, especially when you think about her identity. She is a Black Puerto Rican. So it's a really big deal, challenging the way we look at Puerto Ricanness. So she was born in California, and that's Puerto Ricanness is kind of where I'd like to get your thoughts on. What I'd like to get your thoughts on, because she was born in South Carolina. She wasn't born in Puerto Rico. She actually decided to run for the Puerto Rico national team to honor her heritage because her mother was born in Puerto Rico. And I think later in life, if I'm understanding from the news coverage around her win, later in life, like in her teenage years, she actually traveled to La Isla for training and was finally able to meet her grandmother, other members on her mother's side. But I had seen a lot of chatter online of people saying, well, she's not really Puerto Rican. She doesn't speak Spanish. She wasn't born and raised on the island. Does she qualify as being Puerto Rican? Which I thought is a bit of a silly take. This is the first gold medal she's bringing to the island, and you want to take it in a direction where you're like, well, does it really count? She's not really Puerto Rican. Why are we claiming her? Like, it's kind of a messed up thing, because it's not like she couldn't make the U.S. team. She won a gold medal. She could have made the U.S. team. But for Puerto Ricans competing at the Olympics, Winter Olympics, Summer Olympics, you have 2 years, every 2 years where on an international stage, Puerto Rico is recognized as its own body, as its own governing body, as opposed to falling under the United States. So it's a huge deal. And this is normally a source of pride. So to kind of see the negative chatter in response to a lot of the positive coverage she got, it was a little disheartening. So I don't know. I mean, did y'all see those stories? Like, how do you feel about people challenging someone's Boricua card?
I definitely think, at least from a lot of the things that I've seen online, criticizing her, it's less about, at least in Jasmine's case, it's less about the fact that she was born here, and I think more about the fact that she's Black, and she's very visibly Black. And we know that Latinidad, being Latino, that's not a race. It's just an ethnic group category. We can be many races. We all are. And, we already know that anti-Blackness is a huge thing on the island, off the island. So I think that has everything to do with it in her case, unfortunately. And it's just throwing in the fact that she's also American. So I feel like it's just like this pigeonholing, trying to put her in a box of like what she is,
Yeah.
Which it doesn't really make any sense because, as we've said, Puerto Rico is also part of the United States. So does that make the people that are born on the island not American as well? It's such a weird debate, in my opinion, that shouldn't have been happening in the first place. But again, at least in my opinion, I think it all surrounds around the fact that she's a Black Latino, that she's a Black Puerto Rican.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's a really good point. Did you see, I think with follow-up question, and I think this is something we see regularly when there is that racial undertone, but it's not explicitly said. It's more covert. So like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like, I would see stuff like, son gringos, no, ni saben español. Algunos no ni han viviendo en la isla. I would see stuff like that. Did you see anything that was like people explicitly saying that since she was Black, she wasn't Puerto Rican? Or was it more of like a racial undertone? Because I didn't hear these comments back when Puerto Rico won its first gold medal, or when the Puerto Rican national team beat the U.S. national team. I think that was in Greece in the early 2000s. So I didn't hear those conversations then, and there definitely weren't people that were Spanish speaking or born on the island that performed there. But I didn't see the level of I'll just say, I mean, the level of hate that was geared, to Camacho-Quinn. So I don't know. I mean, did you see anybody like overtly being racist, or was it more like this covert thing? Like they're not saying the quiet part out loud.
I can't remember what year it was, but Miss Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that? What year that was? Where she was actually from Florida, and she's white Boricua, other diaspora. So there was a lot of I remember a lot of similar conversation happening like that of not really being from Puerto Rico and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel same similarities as far as being a gringa and from the US and stuff like that, and not really Puerto Rican. I could definitely say that this is all me search. I haven't dove into this anyway, but yeah, just scrolling to Twitter and everybody, with their comments. I've seen a lot of support in my own little bubble, but I know that's the algorithm just feeding me what I want to read. I've seen a lot of support for Jasmine and a lot of celebrating her. But there have been those tricklings of is she really Puerto Rican because she's from the US and stuff and all that? But it has been much more celebrating on my end. I think what I sort of see overall is very important is kind of the individual opinions is whatever, but what's the structural change happening here? And the structural thing is that Puerto Rico didn't have a gold medal before in this event. Now they do. That's a very historic thing that you can't take away. And whatever anybody wants to say, sort of opinion wise or whatever, she made her decision. And that's not a light decision. You're going to be on international television with billions of people looking at you. You're going to have a flag, a crest on you, on your, on your uniform, and your face is going to be there. That's no small feat. So to say, all these comments or whatever, that's a big decision to make. And I think it's really interesting and really exciting and makes me proud that she made the decision to wear the Puerto Rican flag in front of literally an audience of billions of people. Mm-hmm. So you can look at it the negative way, all these Twitter heads want to do, but I think it's, without a doubt, it's something that on a structural level and on an individual level on her end, and what she did is really incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think I've seen a lot more positivity than negativity. But Ambar, to your point, it's hard not to look at this criticism that she's received and not think it's because of the way she looks. Somehow, I think people will look at it as her being a watered down Puerto Rican, which is so far from the truth. I think we need to celebrate. We need to celebrate these accomplishments because, like you said, Josue, she could have ran for the U.S. I mean, she chose Puerto Rico, so we should be proud of that. So I think whether you're growing up in London or the diaspora, Puerto Rico, being Puerto Rican is a part of you. It's a part of your culture. I know I've been hurt when growing up, if I didn't speak Spanish fluently, someone would say, oh, you don't speak Spanish, you're not Puerto Rican. I've heard other people share similar stories to me, and I don't know why we do that to each other. I think we need to celebrate who we are as people and not put a checklist on what makes you, Puerto Rican or Mexican or what have you. I just don't think that's fair because at the end of the day, it's not like Jasmine was I want to leave Puerto Rico, FPR, I want to leave. I mean, she basically came full circle and embraced her roots. So I think that should be applauded. But any other thought? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Things I wanted to add.
Go for it.
That Jasmine, she actually put her mother's name first in her last name.
Yeah.
So her mom is from Puerto Rico, which I think was really cool, very interesting. So that just shows, how Puerto Rican she is in the first place to, and we all know how important mothers are in Puerto Rican culture. Most of us keep both of our last names to begin with. And then also, just so that we don't forget about this specific incident, Gigi Fernandez, she's a tennis player. She won 2 Olympic gold medals. She posted on Twitter, it was in Spanish, but I'll translate it. after Camacho-Quinn won her race, she was basically questioning. She asked, "Oh, and she's actually Puerto Rican. Does she actually speak Spanish? Was she raised in Puerto Rico?" Very curious. But right before that, she, gave a shout out to Naomi Osaka, who's also been the victim of a lot of, racist remarks or undertones, I should say. So it's very interesting to see how, Puerto Ricans, we kind of pick and choose when and who to attack about their Puerto Ricanness, their Latinidad.
Yeah. No, well put. Well put. I mean, hey, maybe down the road we could get Jasmine on the show. And Bart, make it happen.
We need you.
I would love to get her on the mic and hear some of her thoughts and how that experience went, and dealing with the positivity and some of the negativity as well. Before we took our break, we actually had a really good guest on the show to talk about Jake Paul's connection to Puerto Rico and living in Dorado and taking advantage of Puerto Rico's tax laws. Essentially, Puerto Rico being a tax haven for the rich. So I think even talking about this athlete will be a nice transition into the topic you're going to share with us, Richie. But I recently found out over the summer that Amanda Serrano, she is an amazing boxer, probably one of the best Puerto Rican boxers that Puerto Rico has ever produced, pound for pound. Amazing fighter. She, I think, has 30 knockouts. I can't remember how many wins she has, but she has 30 knockouts. If she gets like 2 or 3 more, she'll have the most knockouts in Puerto Rican boxing history. So pretty big deal. She's also won in, I want to say, jiu-jitsu competitions. She's won in mixed martial arts competitions. And she's even a multi-division champion in boxing. So super athlete we're talking about here. But looking at Jake Paul, the boxing cards he's put in, the fact that he's living in Puerto Rico, taking advantage of the tax laws, basically being a tax evader, but also gentrifying the island. He's not the only person that's been doing this. A lot of rich people have been doing this, definitely with this colonizer mindset. But I was surprised to see Amanda Serrano agree to co-headline this upcoming Jake Paul boxing card that's going to take place on August 29th. So I was just curious, she's curious to get your thoughts on, do you think this is the right decision that Amanda made to say yes to co-headlining this boxing card? Or do you think it was a bad decision? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Because when she's been interviewed about this, participating in this card, she's talked very glowingly about Jake Paul wanting to become a better boxer, really putting the work in. So she's had a lot of complimentary words to say about him. Hasn't really talked about the backdrop of gentrification and tax evasion as it relates to Jake Paul and his brother living there. So I found that quite interesting. But what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think this is the right decision on her part? Wrong decision, somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, and unfortunately, we still have to talk about Logan Paul a little bit longer. I've never met a Logan Paul fan or a Jake Paul fan in my life. But
no.
I don't know, Josue. You sound like you've been keeping up, man, for the fan club.
You know the difference between two of them, So
yeah. You gotta know
you guys
your enemies.
How I haven't said anything about either the whole time because I hate them and I don't want to give them any fuel. So, no.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more like maybe why we don't like these people, right?
Yeah.
Logan Paul earlier this year moved over to Puerto Rico, and that was unclear the reasons why, but one of the reasons that Logan Paul said was that was about taxes in Puerto Rico. He said you're motivated to do more and make more money because of the implications that come with it. And he's not the first person, or he won't be the last person to go to Puerto Rico to take advantage of the tax system that's very much different from the rest of the United States. Right now talking about Act 60, which is sort of what makes up the tax code. And I'm going to source a little bit here from the Times. Under Act 20, export services companies that set up an office on the island can get a 4% corporate tax rate and a full tax exemption on all dividends if their annual revenue is over $3 million. They're required to hire at least one local Puerto Rican employee. And then the second law, Act 22, offers full exemption from all local taxes on passive income to individuals. Its beneficiaries are not allowed to have lived in Puerto Rico for the last 10 years and to have spent a number of days on the island to maintain their status. They also need to purchase residential property and donate at least $10,000 a year to local nonprofit. I know that's a lot of numbers, but just think about how much taxes you pay, and versus, if you make more than $3 million in Puerto Rico, that's kind of bananas. We've all seen, our paycheck stubs. We look at the gross pay and then we look at the net pay. It's like, what is crazy? And to know that they're being taxed even less, a millionaire who will flee to Puerto Rico, that's not very fair, right? When we know the context and the history of a lot of bad things that have gone on the island with the earthquakes and hurricanes, and it's just not fair, right?
Not even flee, but like strategically, moving to take advantage and steal the resources, and the moment they find a better deal elsewhere, they'll just be gone. They'll use it for what it is, and then they're gone. They don't care.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed our last episode before break because we really took the deep dive on Act 20, Act 22, and their absorption into Act 60. But it's very upsetting to me personally because it just feels very predatory. But this is legislation. This is policy the Puerto Rican government enacted. So it's kind of like there has to be change at the representative level and how people vote. I think we get too tied into territory as defining the political parties in Puerto Rico as opposed to what the policy is. And that is what creates a space for bad policy like this to exist. Richie, you mentioned as a part of Act 60, well, Act 20 was absorbed into that. You said that the corporate tax, it's for businesses, that the corporate tax rate was 4%. So they're paying 4% on the money. I mean, that's a lot of, you're talking over $3 million, that's a lot of money. However, you compare that to your point, the U.S., the corporate tax rate here is 21%. 21%. What was that? More than five times the amount. So they're paying 5 times less the amount if they move to Puerto Rico. And then for individuals, you mentioned Act 22, which also was absorbed into Act 60, 0% in capital gains tax for individuals. You know what that number is here in the U.S.? Trivia. Anybody know what that number is?
No.
37%. My gosh, I love numbers way too much. But 37%, that's wild. I wish I could pay 0% in capital gains tax if I had capital. And then what I also found interesting was that the PR Department of Economic Development and Commerce, it was like, we created all these jobs and we got over 140 million in consumer goods and services in Puerto Rico. But of course, none of the info used in that study was actually accessible to the public. So journalists like yourself, Richie and Ambar, like you didn't have access to those numbers to really figure out what the legit numbers are and what the patterns are and what the story really is and how this affects the general longevity of the island. So it's upsetting. And I think what makes me laugh a little bit, like laugh, is the fact that one of these requirements is that if you have the business in Puerto Rico, you have to at least hire one Puerto Rican. What the hell is that about? Like one Puerto Rican and you just get a token? Like if I can hire somebody, if I have a tech company and I was like, well, our custodial staff member is a Puerto Rican and you're paying them over $7 minimum wage, but you can have someone fly in from San Francisco, say they're living in Puerto Rico, and pay them a 6-figure salary. That's just, I feel like that's laughable. That's a ridiculous requirement. I would have said a majority of your employees should be Puerto Rican. It's not like Puerto Rico is a third world country. Like, we got smart ass people in Puerto Rico, intelligent people. I mean, you look at the Arecibo. I'm gonna get on a tangent here, so I'm gonna stop myself. But there's plenty of examples because we're running out of time. But there's plenty of examples that you could point to of talent and knowledge in Puerto Rico. And to say only one person qualifies you to take advantage of this tax law, I think is ridiculous. So it's one of the laws I hate the most in the island.
Yeah, and the reason why all of this matters is just because it exasperates just the problems between the rich and the poor on the island. And it just feels weird, to know also that the rich, they're not even from there, it's not wealth that's being built up or that's going to be helping people that have lived there before,
Yeah. Well, I think that one tax law, the Act 22, that's a part of Act 60 now. I think it was like even for individuals as Puerto Ricans, like unless you've lived outside of Puerto Rico in the 6 years of the law being created, like you wouldn't be able to take advantage of this. So there's people that actually live in Puerto Rico that can't take advantage of a lower capital gains tax, of a 0% capital gains tax. So you're not even benefiting, it's just benefiting pretty much anybody outside of the island. So it's kind of messed up. It's very messed up.
What could an American or someone else that's a foreigner to the island do to, I guess, not create so much gentrification or to, I guess, level out the playing field when it comes to, I guess, not just giving jobs, but also just
stay out.
Stay out. Just no solution. Stay out.
Don't come.
Okay.
No. I mean, I obviously that's an emotional reaction, but there's so I just pull up right here, 142,000 people, Boricuas left La Isla after Hurricane Maria, and it's estimated that in 2020 to 2022, about another 300,000 will be leaving, and people who then come into La Isla, like what are they aligning themselves with? What are their intentions, their motives? Because if it's to build out a chain of restaurants, turn whatever town they move into to a little suburb-like thing from wherever they were, create another Silicon Valley or something. Like there's so much history on La Isla. There's so much culture that is just, you're cleansing. It's a cleansing of all of that, because you're bringing in what as a culture, and if there's a true collaboration, and I want to sort of optimistically say it is possible, though I'm very doubtful, then that's one thing. But really, what it's feeling like, and I think what we could probably all argue, is that it's zero regard for what Puerto Rico is. And you give that 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and it's just like, what does the island look like? I don't want it to look like mini USA. I think that there are movements happening on La Isla against this. There are forces pushing against it. So that's definitely something that we should know. It's not all doom and gloom. There are people putting up a fight, and we should be encouraged by that, and we should all feel empowered by that. And so I think definitely, like, it's not the end of the world if you want to move to Puerto Rico, but what are you moving to Puerto Rico for? I highly doubt Jake Paul or Logan Paul are moving there with positive intentions for La Isla. If somebody's moving there because they do see a good opportunity and they have a great idea for a business, whatever, and they, I think policy is better than personal preference. So if there was policy, like Joshua just mentioned, of getting a majority of Puerto Ricans to actually be hired by a company, that's very, very, very different, because then you could, you help build and sustain local economies. People don't have to end up coming to the U.S. For job opportunities. They could stay there, and you build and you develop on La Isla. Versus one Puerto Rican. Well, what happens to the 1,000 that need a job in an area, but you've just simply brought over from Silicon Valley, from the US, whoever, wherever, 1,000 of whoever you like for whatever reason. And there is a lot of talent, like Joshua mentioned, on the island. There's tons of talent there, world-class professors, researchers, etc. And that's not going to be, no attention will be paid to that. I feel from any of these richer folks that are moving to the island. That's my soapbox moment.
I think a cap or like an income cap would do wonders, not just on the island, but I think in the United States in general. And also just, I don't know, they're rich people. We should take their money, right? I think it's not a bad idea to suggest that we should tax rich people and use that money to build infrastructure and to, invest in communities and things like that. Because if, I think the world that we live in right now, there's just this huge wealth divide. And the only way that we're going to really solve that is by just taking their money. So if you're a millionaire listening to this, please give us your money.
Well said. I agree.
Part two of that question, I wanted to be, can a Puerto Rican American also be a gentrifier on the island? What can they do to make a fair economic impact without gentrifying a place they love?
I think that's a question that a lot of people struggle with, even here in Chicago. I mean, I think in a lot of cities, I think it gets a little complicated. I think you, on one end, you would be contributing to it, because if you're coming into a space with a higher income and at a higher income bracket, what normally happens is, you kind of end up pricing people out that can't afford it. So you can almost inadvertently, by trying to reconnect with your roots and reestablish your roots and reclaim your Puerto Rican land from maybe land that's not owned by a Puerto Rican, or maybe there's like just open land that you want to say, hey, I want to set down roots here. I'm tired of being here in the States. I want to go back to the motherland. You could be contributing to that, because realistically, if you have the ability to go to Puerto Rico from the States, you probably have some form of capital that gives you that ability, some sort of privilege that gives you that ability. Not saying in every case, but in most cases, I would argue that is the case. But yeah, I think you can contribute to gentrification. The only solution, and I don't know if this is really the best solution, but it's one, is being actively engaged in local politics, to organize people to actually vote for people that will put in policy that will prevent people from being displaced, that will prevent people from being stuck in a place where they don't have access to food, that puts in policy that ultimately creates communities where you have mixed incomes, you have things like affordable housing in those spaces. But I think ultimately that comes down to policy decisions. And if you're just accepting the status quo instead of actively trying to be present and ingrain yourself in what the reality of the community that you are moving to is, and trying to actively organize to make life better for yourself, for yourself and those around you, if you're not doing that and you're just kind of accepting the status quo, I think, you're contributing to it. But you can actively combat gentrification even if you are moving into a new community. Josue, you had a story you wanted to bring up involving Lin-Manuel Miranda and the responsibility of storytelling, so specifically from the diaspora. So I want to kick it over to you. What did you want to share?
Yeah. So Lin-Manuel Miranda is very high achieving artist. We can see that. And I think that sort of as old as time itself, critiquing art is just as old as art itself. And some of the criticisms, though, I think that have come Lin-Manuel Miranda's way in recent time has gone beyond the art. though that's, still an issue in its own way. But a lot of stuff like the things he advocates for, taking up the space that he does, and talking about Puerto Rico and issues on the island. And so really, I want to take this moment to just kind of talk about using him as a focus point, but also looking at our responsibilities as storytellers in general, because this could apply across the board, but obviously here on the Paseo Podcast, focusing on Puerto Rican stories, us as being in the diaspora, Richie, our honorary Boricua. What is our responsibility as storytellers? It's said that, like, when you see a movie, when you see a play, etc., everything is very well intentioned and constructed with a meaning. And when you do find a mistake, it's a movie mistake, and you usually point it out. Like, there's a Starbucks cup in Star Wars. But for the most part, why is stuff framed a certain way? So we could look at something like Hamilton and think, why were these phrases used? Why were some things left out about Alexander Hamilton? Why was his quick summary and bio mentioned with these bullet points, but left out the bullet points of, like, the darker sides of what he was involved with? And then same thing with In the Heights. Very catchy songs, sure. But what about the neighborhood? Who's represented in the neighborhood? Who's shown as main characters? Who's in the background as characters? That's all very, heavily done with intention. And so definitely want to just get general thoughts about how I think we're all storytellers in our own ways. Obviously, Josh with the podcast, Ricky Embar with your amazing, like, writing journalistic abilities. Like, we all do this in our own ways. And so I think it's important probably for our audience listening to hear how we sort of, like, frame this and think about it in our own means. And then definitely how we approach our work with trying to be as, I guess, like, fair as possible as we possibly could be, and leaving as much space. And then, like, sort of respectively, like, not in a bad way, but just staying in your lane. Right? There's some stuff that's outside of our lanes, and it's okay to admit that. You asked me about something in left lane, but I'm in right lane. Like, oh, I'm gonna stay in this lane. Like, I don't know. I'm sorry. So just general ideas. Definitely, I have, like, some thoughts of my own of how I approach that. But definitely want to hear from everybody else as well.
I'd say for myself, for me, it's important to do a lot of listening before I start talking. Especially a lot of these Puerto Rican stories. I can't just, like, read one story and be like, okay, I can summarize it. Like, no, I feel like I need to listen way more and listen to a lot of people. I think that's why sometimes people get backlash. They'll do research for a couple months and they'll think, fine, yes, I'm a pro now.
I feel like as storytellers too, journalism is a little bit different, but in general, you kind of have this tendency to want to, like, glamorize details sometimes. And I think that's unfortunately what, Miranda has fallen victim to a lot of the times with his work. Because, there's nothing pretty or, like, musical about, like, imperialism or, like, colonization. But yet we have, like, a whole musical about it, where it's, like, reimagined. So I think it's just important to, like, take a step back and, like, kind of think about, like, am I idealizing this a little bit too much? Or, like, how can I, make this digestible, but not too intense at the same time,
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to, I think as storytellers, we have a responsibility to have proper representation that reflects the time period or the community we're trying to represent. I think Hamilton's an outlier because I think that the not, like, countering Ambada's point, but more so the main characters in history were all white, but they were played by people of color. I think sends a message that this is a country of immigrants and this isn't just something that's for white people. So, like, on one end, that I respect that, I find beauty in that. But yeah, Hamilton just kind of glosses over a lot of the uglier side of things. But I find the most beautiful conversations and storytelling to be when you approach a topic authentically and transparently. And if you don't do that, then you're leaving the door open for criticism. And I think you leave the door open for people to not believe the story or give them an excuse to kind of claim to attack the accuracy of a story that's being told. So you have to be authentic in these conversations. Something like In the Heights, I remember Rita Moreno talking about, I think she was on the Colbert Show, and she was like, can you just stop? Like, can we just let the movie be out for a little bit before we criticize it? And she ended up having to walk back those comments. She said a few other problematic things. But I think you open the door for a very complicated and frustrating discourse, because I think when you have something in Lin-Manuel Miranda's case within the Heights, this is Lin-Manuel Miranda we're talking about. Like any studio, I mean, this is his movie. He wrote the musical too, so it's like he owns the intellectual property. So you're talking about Dominican neighborhood. I mean, Puerto Ricans, we have all shapes, colors, and I would argue that's the same thing in the DR. But you can't deny that there is a strong African presence in the history of the Dominican Republic. So whenever I've gone to the DR, I don't feel like I saw people represented that I've seen that were Dominican, even Dominicans in my own life that I grew up with here in Chicago. I didn't really see that reflected in that movie. So, and that's where I get into a little bit of a frustrated space, because it's like, I mean, not all skin folk are kinfolk is the line I really like, because it's like, I mean, you got all this power, you got all this notoriety, you have the leverage, and yet this is how you chose to cast this film. Like, just because you made it now. So now that you made it, you're making decisions just like the people that were a few years ago, keeping you out of the room where it happens. And you're doing the same thing. Whether it was subconscious, overt, or just done by accident. I think beyond Lin-Manuel Miranda, we just as storytellers have a responsibility to approach these conversations honestly and authentically as we can. And someone like Lin-Manuel Miranda has the resources and the connections to really approach his storytelling as authentically as possible. And he made a misstep. And no one's perfect. I mean, as storytellers, we will make mistakes. We may not have all the facts. We may talk about a subject that we need to do a bit more research on. But we have to acknowledge that we're not perfect and that we will do better. And I think Lin tried to do that. But I think from the onset, that has to be the utmost priority whenever we're trying to tell a story.
Definitely. And I think you brought up a good point that I kind of want to segue into, which is, definitely doing better. But I think that one of the biggest sort of critiques I've heard is this idea of, sort of forgetting exactly how you were approached or looked at the beginning, kept out of a room, and now just doing that on the same, now that you're on the other side, you're doing that sort of back, and really being cognizant of and mindful of trying to do better. I think that I also think about who's the audience that Lin-Manuel Miranda actually attracts appraisal from. This isn't a scientific study, but in my research, in my world, in my realm, I don't really see a lot of Boricuas talking about Lin-Manuel Miranda. I see a lot of white liberals talking about him and loving him, just so much. And it's just a situation I've seen in my life. And I just find that interesting. I'm not in Humboldt Park talking about him. I'm not, I'm not hearing conversations about him in my family. It's friends of mine from DePaul, coworkers, and it's a really interesting dynamic. I kind of want to push it off to anybody else. Who do you see actually talking about Lin-Manuel Miranda in your life?
It's funny that you bring that up, because I remember when Hamilton was on Broadway several years ago, somebody at DePaul, I won't name any names, was like, hey, you're Puerto Rican, you must love this. You must know who this guy is. And I remember just looking at them like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I'm so sorry.
Nah, it's all good. All guests are welcome.
Yeah.
My dog's appeared on the show a couple times too, so.
To your point, I think you're absolutely right. You know, in our Puerto Rican circles, he's not like a topic of conversation at all. And if he is, it's like very brief. We don't really have a lot to say about him. If we do, it's not always positive. And I also think that you're definitely right. Like who is he making these movies for? I think a lot of the times people in like, I guess, minority communities like make it big. And we strive to like make it to like the Oscars or get the Emmys and things like that. Which, you know, traditionally the Academy is all white. They're all old white men. And is that really who these movies are for? You know, who these pieces of art are for? So I think that's a great, you know, question to pose.
I'll keep my response brief. It's a mixed bag for me. I mean, we've had people on from the show. Like we did an episode about Boricua. She was celebrating her birthday in quarantine right when we went, like around the time we first went to shelter in place. She works for the Miracle Center. They've had Lin and his dad at their theater. They've been big supporters of them, so I've heard it in those circles. More so in the art circles in the Puerto Rican community. I've heard Lin-Manuel and his father come up quite a bit, even at the National Puerto Rican Museum we have here in Humboldt Park. But then I also hear about Lin and his dad on the flip side. Like, yeah, a lot of friends. I got a lot of Boricua friends on Twitter that go in on him and his dad for being in support of Promesa. So less about their accomplishments in the arts world, but more about their advocacy for policy that was very detrimental for La Isla. So the fact that they're both such prominent supporters of that failed Promesa policy to the Fiscal Control Board, but also the fact that it was demanded by many in the Puerto Rican community that they apologize. While they did apologize, they did not walk back their support for Promesa. So apologized for supporting it, but didn't say that they did not support it anymore. So a very interesting, thing to notice in their response to a lot of that criticism. So I would say definitely agree. White liberals love Lin-Manuel. They're probably the reason that they'll be waving Puerto Rican flags. But at the same time, it's just more of a mixed bag in my world, I would say. Yeah. Okay, Ambar. You had a very good one. This one I've been waiting for throughout our conversation because this affects more than Puerto Rico, but Puerto Rico especially can get its ass kicked by climate crisis. So wanted to get your thoughts and give us a high level view. What news story was on your mind?
Sure. So earlier we were talking a little bit about how gentrification is pushing a lot of Puerto Ricans off the island. Climate crises is also probably the next biggest, if not the biggest thing that's pushing Puerto Ricans off. Mm-hmm. So research has been suggesting, and this is from the Stormwater publication of the Water Environmental Federation, or the WEF. So research from them has been suggesting that Puerto Rico is particularly vulnerable to climate change. In fact, it's one of the world's locations that is most vulnerable to climate change. And experts believe that the uptick in tropical storms will eventually lead to a large catastrophe of storms, which we've already seen, of course, that will greatly affect the Northern Caribbean in the next several years. I think the biggest thing that we all kind of think of, and we've talked about it earlier in this episode, is Hurricane Maria, which was the Category 4 storm that hit September of 2017. Absolutely devastated the island, over $90 billion in damages, which still greatly affects the island today. The power grid was basically wiped out to this day. There's power outages basically on the daily. It's a bit of a rough situation to go to Puerto Rico. It's not, the island of dreams, the paradise that, Logan and Jake Paul claim it to be. But but of course they live in a much different reality. So,
and those hurricanes will just get worse, right? Too, with climate change.
Yeah.
Like you could see, didn't we have like one of the first times there was like 2 major storms? That wasn't it. It could have been Irma and Maria, I thought, where there were just 2 big storms back to back that were like high category storms. So we could live in a world where it's like every other week or every other day, you're seeing a high category storm hitting the island, and just the devastation that could cause.
2 of the worst hurricanes to ever hit the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Really 2 of the worst in the world's history. It can be compared with, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, which were significantly worse, but also, still comparable. Thousands of lives were lost. I think it was, I'm going to have to fact check myself on this, but a university did a study where they estimated at least 4,000 people were killed, either directly or indirectly as a result of that hurricane. We saw people hooked up to machines, mobile hospitals, all kinds of just a very dire situation. So there's this ecologist at the University of Texas in Austin. His name is Carlos Ramos Sharon. He's been studying the topography and like the climate of Puerto Rico since Hurricane Maria. And he says that we need to stop talking about climate change in the future tense, because we're already experiencing it, especially in Puerto Rico. The island, again, severely under-equipped to handle a storm like Maria. The infrastructure was bad to begin with. The storm caused over $90 billion in damages, and there's Puerto Ricans that are still waiting to get relief from that. You fly into Puerto Rico and you go over La Perla specifically, and like the San Juan area, and you still see homes that are tarped up. You go and you see buildings that are just completely demolished. So just a ridiculous situation, again, with little to no help from the government. We saw Donald Trump throwing paper towels at people instead of giving actual help. The Puerto Rican government is still owed money from the Trump administration. Little by little, we're getting, payments, but it's not enough. That same ecologist, Ramos Sharon, he stated in an article, which I have linked here, in some parts of the island, Hurricane Maria caused flooding that exceeded a 500-year event. And events with these 100 and 500-year metrics just cannot be that common. And if this is not what climate change is supposed to be, then I don't know what it is. And so this summer and last summer, the island has been experiencing earthquake after earthquake after earthquake. The last earthquake was about a week ago from the date that we're recording. So it happened 9 miles outside of Huanica, which is on the southwest coast of Puerto Rico, on the 14th. It was a 4.1 on the Richter scale. For context, there was a earthquake last year on the early morning hours of what we know as El Día de los Tres Reyes, or Three Kings Day in English. That one was a 5.8 on the Richter, and the very next day it was a 6.4. Another very devastating event to happen to the island. And keep in mind that the island had already been struggling, hit by hurricanes years prior. Now they're dealing with an earthquake or earthquakes. There's a big housing crisis. And then in the middle of all that, just a couple months later, we get hit by a global pandemic. So you can see just how, again, how dire the situation is. And this specifically calls even more Puerto Ricans to move out of the island and into the mainland United States. Not just here in Chicago, but specifically in Central Florida and Orlando, Kissimmee. There's thousands of Puerto Ricans there now. And we know that these people that are fleeing from these types of natural disasters are considered climate refugees. There's a think tank from Australia that has predicted that at least 1.2 billion people could be displaced by such climate-related events by 2050. One of the questions I wanted to ask you guys is how has your family, if at all, been impacted by climate change in Puerto Rico how have you been impacted by climate change? We live in Chicago. I know we've been experiencing heat waves and just, ridiculous temperatures. I think this winter is going to be very brutal for us. But of course, because this is Paseo Podcast, I have questions about, your families in Puerto Rico and what you've seen when you've been down there recently.
I mean, definitely like the hurricanes, is a big one. Like my abuela, who still has her house over there, just because of she has a house over in Arecibo, had to move to Chicago because it's not, while her house is okay, thank God, it's the infrastructure around her that has collapsed. And so roads and bridges and stuff aren't available to travel, to go elsewhere, to go into town to get stuff. So she's right now in Chicago. So just stuff like that. And I would say that's probably the similar stories I've heard kind of from friends of mine and in my network and stuff.
Same here. I mean, last time I was in Puerto Rico, I could see on the plane, all the blue tarps. You can still see the effects of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma on the island. I was very fortunate that my abuela was actually in town for my wedding around the time Hurricane Maria hit the island, so dodged a bullet there. But she lives in San Lorenzo, and where she lives, it wasn't hit as devastatingly as other parts of the island. So she's definitely lucky. Definitely some damage to the property she has there. She was there throughout the whole pandemic and the power outages and the earthquakes. Thankfully, I think just where she's located, it didn't impact her as much. So my family was more inland than anything. So pretty much dodged a few bullets, but still were impacted. But there's people on the island and other families that I'm sure I know were impacted more significantly than mine was. And that's me talking about like my immediate family. Like I couldn't tell you how my third cousin on my second cousin Diaz's side is doing. But you can, like I said, whenever you go, you can still see the effects of the earthquakes and the hurricanes, and the power, the weak power system. You can see that in very glaring ways and very small ways. It's frustrating to see at this point, knowing that we're consistently getting earthquakes, knowing that Maria and Irma happened years ago, that the island still isn't at a point where they're helping people to get back on their feet, and there's still people that are just displaced, or are living in really crappy conditions because no one's offered assistance and they can't afford to fix something as simple as a leaky roof. So to see that not done, it's like, man, as climate change continues to get worse, if we can't handle fixing people's roofs years after a devastating hurricanes, that does not spell well for the future when stuff really starts to go down at an even scarier level when it comes to the changes to our environment, to our climate.
Right, and you bring up a good point about trying to shift to renewable energy. In 2019, the former governor kicked his booty out, Ricardo Rosselló. He signed into law a new climate change initiative that calls for the island to reduce its carbon emissions 50% in the next 5 years. So by 2023 at that point, and transition to 100% renewable energy by 2050. Puerto Rico is nowhere near that 5-year mark, of course. And also without any relief funds or any investment from the rich millionaires and billionaires that are moving onto the island, we can't make that happen. The deadline is looming. It's 2021. 29 years doesn't seem, or it seems like it's far away, but it's really not that far away. And I know, you see this on like Twitter and maybe on YouTube and, other discussion podcasts and things like that. Am I going to be able to meet my own grandchildren? Am I going to be able to take my children to Puerto Rico one day, and are they going to experience the same Puerto Rico that I've experienced and my parents have experienced? So it's all very, very interesting stuff. A lot of companies, again, BP in particular, they want to switch over to all renewable energy as well. But we're just not anywhere near that, you know, like many experts have still been saying, like, what if it's too late? Like, we're reaching that point where if we don't act now, if we don't invest in this renewable energy now and cut the fossil fuels, invest in like a, you know, better public transportation and stuff like that, what if it's too late?
Yeah, I think that's a very real concern. I 100% agree. It's scary.
Yeah. One thing, kind of I guess a more lighthearted thing with this topic that I noticed. I went to Puerto Rico like the winter after Hurricane Maria happened, and I encountered a woman coincidentally named Maria, who she was making alcapurrias, and I was with my dad, and he was like, "Hey, let's stop and talk to her," and I was like, "Okay." And she told us about how she lives in a barrio in Dorado, which is where my dad grew up. And she, during the hurricane, she told me that she would feed everybody in her community. So when FEMA didn't show up with, you know, food supplies and stuff like that, she was out in her garden getting food and making food for the community. Like they would just make big pots of food and just hand it out. So I think that was common. I already know it was common because I spoke to another woman in a different part of Puerto Rico that also had like her home farm and was giving out food in a similar manner. So I just think that speaks to the resilience of our people. You know, like, we're going to make it no matter what. We're going to feed each other. We're going to look out for each other. Even if the United States government decides not to, that we're always going to do that for each other.
La brega, the struggle. We're used to being self-determining at this point. So I love that you brought that up, Ambar. I remember seeing a video on social media and news reports of people really banding together to get access to clean water, to feed each other. I mean, offer support in any way they can. And I felt like it was a beautiful human moment, especially in a moment where you're surrounded by devastation, disaster, and you can easily kind of slink back into a corner and just be very depressed. So to see people respond in a way where it was, no, I'm going to help my fellow human beings. And you could have had people easily hoarding stuff for themselves out of fear. So to see people so generous with their time, talent, and treasure, I mean, that was a beautiful thing to say. I appreciate you bringing that up. Okay, Ambar, Richie, Josue, you are a part of this machine that we call this labor of love that we call the Paseo Podcast. You help keep things running. You help me from going crazy doing this by myself. So very grateful for you all for making the time today, but also grateful for your work. So I appreciate y'all being on the episode today and giving our audience a chance to meet you all and how badass you all are. So thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
All right, y'all. Have a great rest of the day.